Welcome back, my dear followers, friends, viewers, or welcome if it's the first time that you're watching my YouTube channel, My Paranormal and Mystery TV. This time, this documentary is divided in two parts. In the first part, I will talk and make you watch at my personal computer creepy videos about witchcraft, the horrifying witch hunt by the Catholic Church and Christian Fanatics happened in the Middle Ages until the end of the 17th century. How these people were tortured and brutally killed. Then I will show you in details Malleus Maleficarum, the witches of Salem. These horrifying crimes happen in the past, don't have to be forgotten, must be absolutely condemned. In the second part of this documentary, instead, we move in modern times. If witch hunt was absolutely to condemn, we don't have to forget the most horrifying, brutal, satanic, ritualistic murders and serial killers made in the name of Satan, and the increase of satanic secret sects and satanic cults extremely dangerous that are underestimated and can bring to countless human sacrifices, brutal, unimaginable, cruel tortures, and horrific murders of human beings as offering to the devil, like the horrifying cases I'm going to show you, make you watch all the videos, all the horrifying videos and images, and these horrifying murders are in modern times, not in the Middle Ages. So, in these modern satanic rituals, murders, there are unimaginable tortures of human beings, rapes, mutilations, dismemberments, desecration of corpses, cannibalism, and much more, like the horrifying cases and video I'm going to make you watch. So since now I tell you that I will show you real, disturbing, horrifying videos of these crimes and the victims. But now I want to tell you the real story of the witches of Salem, because here I have the official documents to explain you how this horrifying witch hunt of the past doesn't have to be forgotten. So, the Salem witch trials started in 1692 in Salem, County of Essex, Massachusetts. The allegations of witchcraft extended in few months in the near cities like Andover, Topsfield, Malden, Beverly, Lynn, Boston, and many other cities. The trials started on April 1692 and end up on November 1692, when the protest of the most influential religious of Massachusetts pushed the governor to suspend them. The following year, a special court examined the pending cases and abolished the crime of witchcraft, and so few people survived and wasn't executed like, unfortunately, many others. But how did it all start? Between 1691 and 1692, Betty Paris and Abigail were the former the daughter and the latter the nephew of Reverend Paris, started to behave in a strange way. They were very silent. They hid themselves behind several objects, and they started to crawl on the floor. They called some doctors, but no one of them succeeded in understanding which disturbs the young girls. So Dr. William Grigg stated that it could be a case of diabolical possession, and if so, it couldn't cure them because it was a crime made by a witch or by a wizard through the evil eye or evil spell, and so jurisdiction of the judicial authorities. In the beginning, Reverend Paris decided not to contact the judicial authorities and asked suggestions to local pastors. And they suggest him to have faith in God and to trust in God. However, the rumors of the evil eye spread, and many inhabitants of the village urged to solve the problem in a different way, because other adolescents started to behave in the same strange way. Elizabeth Paris, Abigail William, Anne Putnam, Betty Hubbard, Mercy Short, Mary Warren, and other young girls were pressured to reveal the names of the women who could be witches or possessed by the devil. Betty and Abigail accused an Indian slave, Tituba. Reverendo Paris bought this poor slave. So Anne Putnam, who was 12, and Elizabeth Hubbard, who was 14, confirmed the allegation against Tituba. and they said other names of other two women, accusing them to be witches, Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good. The former was an old, infirm woman. The latter was a beggar. So immediately a tribunal was established in the meeting house. Tituba, Sarah Osborne, Sarah Good got arrested with the allegation of witchcraft. And Tituba confessed to be a witch. So the inhabitants of the village believed in the confession of Tituba, extorted under torture. Remember the shame of that period. That woman was an Indian slave. So her confession had been extorted with terrible tortures. And on March the 1st, 1692, all the three women got imprisoned. All three. However, the manifestations of hysteria, strange behaviors didn't cease at all, and the witch hunt increased. People like Dorothy Good, who was the daughter, who was only 4 years old, and she was the daughter of Sarah Good, was accused to be a witch or to be possessed by the devil. Other women accused were Abigail and Deliverance Hobbs, and Martha Corey and Elizabeth Proctor. The number of the people imprisoned in these months increased in an excessive way, and even men were accused and imprisoned, like Giles Corey, who was the husband of Martha Corey, and John Proctor, who was the husband of Elizabeth Proctor. The religious authorities invited to pray. And Dedat Lawson reached the village to understand what was happening in that village, which was the situation. And meanwhile, he was at Paris' house. He saw a creepy crisis of the nephew Abigail Williams. Lawson decided to stay, and on March the 20th, at the meeting house, he delivered a sermon against witchcraft. Meanwhile, women who suffered of these strange disturbs increased over and over. These crises extended throughout the colony, throughout Massachusetts, at the point that the venue of the trials was moved to Salem town. Abigail Williams accused George Burroughs, who was ex-pastor of the village, to be an evilish wizard and to be the guilty of the cases of evil spells and hysteria among especially young women. And Borog was interrogated on April. The jails were full of suspects. However, until April 1692, it wasn't impossible to start even an early trial, because Massachusetts hadn't a governor from 1689, and the law forbade to start a trial without an official authority. In the case of in jail, Sarah Osborne and her newborn daughter died. Other prisoners got sick. At the end of the month of May, the English royals sent to Salem the governor, Sir William Fees, to start the trials. The court was made by 6 members appointed by him and chaired by the Vice Governor William Stoughton. On June the 2nd, it happened the first trial that ended up with the sentence to death by hanging. Bridget Bishop was executed only 8 days after her condemned to death. And the place where she had been executed is known as Witch's Hill. On June the 29th, other 5 women went to trials and they were all condemned to death. 5 of them were immediately executed. While Elizabeth Proctor, because she was pregnant, her execution was delayed. George Burroughs recited perfectly our Father, but even him was condemned to death and executed. At the beginning of September, 4 people were under trials and sentenced to death. And on September the 17th, there was the last hearing of the court. Giles Corey, the husband of Martha Corey, didn't recognize the authority of the court, and he stayed silent for a all the time of his interrogation. So he underwent a very tough, not human torture. He was made to lie down prone, and many burdens put on his body in a way to crush his chest and force him to confess. However, Corey stayed in silence and died crushed and suffocated. All the people who had been condemned to death, if later they confessed to be guilty of witchcraft and said the names of other suspects, didn't go to death penalty. So maybe even lying, they saved themselves from the death penalty. I don't even imagine how many lies to save their own life from these horrifying executions and tortures. So, during the summer, 19 people had been hanged. On September the 22nd was the day of the last execution. A chariot that was taking the condemned to the gallows, a wheel of the chariot went into a pothole of the ground, and the girls, considered victims of evil spells, who saw the scene, screamed that the devil was trying to save his followers. 6 of the people executed were men. The other ones were women, especially old, very poor women. In the end, 144 people went at trials with these allegations. 19 people were executed. Even John Proctor was executed. The Reverend Mother, who had been representative of the colony in London, protested bitterly against the work of the court, getting the support of the most influential reverends of the Massachusetts. At the beginning of October, Mother delivered a sermon stating that it would have been better that 10 witches were free than an only innocent executed. So, on November, the Governor William Feast ordered the suspensions of the trials, and at the beginning of the following year, he stated the inadmissibility of the proofs against these pending cases against these suspects. So the nightmare finally ended up. And Elizabeth Proctor wasn't executed anymore. So, this creepy, horrifying case of history, the horrifying witch hunt by the Catholic Church, by Christian Fanatics, then the hunt at the witches of Salem has never been forgotten, and it's entered in the collective imagination, and it keeps on to be a source of inspiration for movies, theaters, books, and much more. And now, are you ready to watch the videos? Let's go! Warning! Some images could disturb the sensitivity of the viewers.
Of a modern scientific view, witchcraft and its persecution is merely a product of hysteria. Yet, sorcery and fear thereof is as old as civilization itself. Whatever the true cause of the accusations, instances of witches and witchcraft trials represent some of the darkest moments in human history. Thought to have caused intentional harm, Europeans in early modern times persecuted witches on principle. Nowhere is this more evident than in the witchcraft trials that occurred in the Holy Roman Empire, where thousands were tied up and wed to the flames. Rarely was the morality of such violent and widespread persecution of supposed witches questioned. That was century, the power of the devil on earth was a very real and tangible force. Evidence of Satan's dark influence was everywhere, as were his agents. One only needed a faithful eye to see it. This belief spread with reverent force from the Old to the New World, most especially in the town of Salem, Massachusetts, in the year 1692. What would be remembered as an infamous case in witch trial history. In the trials of the witches of Salem, all manner of absurd evidence was allowed in court. Most damaging of all was how a person could claim that the spectre of someone had visited them and caused them harm. This alone was usually enough to send someone to the gallows. In the midst of the chaos of witch mania, some used this as an opportunity to amass wealth, as in some cases, the property of the accused was given to the accusers. Above all, however, it seemed that accusations were made to
These are official documents!
Fingers were pointed and tongues wagged at an incredible rate. The dark atmosphere of vindictiveness that descended over Salem can be best felt in the case of John Proctor. John Proctor was a successful businessman who operated a tavern in the area. When his wife, Elizabeth Bassett, was accused of witchcraft, he came to her defense. Proctor...
These are other official documents of 1692. That's incredible.
Williams had the trust of officials. Having been one of the initial accusers, the accusations were taken seriously. They claimed that Proctor had forced them to touch the devil's book, to reject God, and to engage in other, more salacious activities. Proctor defended himself and his wife Elizabeth with great ability and reason. Unfortunately, he did not live in very reasonable times. They were both sentenced to death. Proctor was hanged on the 19th of August, 1692. Fortunately, before Elizabeth could meet the noose, she was found to be pregnant. This gave her a reprieve until the baby was born, by which time the trials had ceased, and her life was saved.
Malleus Maleficarum.
Part. Everything we commonly think of surrounding most types of witches comes from this book, also known as the Hammer of Witches or the Witch Hunter's Bible. It is the single most important historical document on witchcraft from this early period, and one of the most impactful books on human history ever written. It set up the doctrine that made up the common beliefs about witches within the Catholic faith, and was directly responsible for the witch purges of Europe that raged for hundreds of years. Written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a German churchman and member of the Inquisition, it was intended to stand as the Catholic Church's official view on the concept of witches and witchcraft, in which Kramer lays out the definition of what a witch is, what powers are at the disposal of a witch, and the legal proceedings that communities should take when capturing, trying, and executing witches. It was the second most circulated book in the world for roughly 300 years. Intended originally for Germanic audiences, the book's impact was felt massively in France and Italy, causing untold casualties, and to a lesser extent in England, where witchcraft was considered more of a civil crime for most of the purges, and was punished in secular courts. The book was later adopted by Protestants in both civil and ecclesiastical courts, and led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people over a 300-year campaign. The book is also aggressively misogynistic, at one point saying, "What else is a woman but a foe to friendship, an inescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature painted in her fair colors. Therefore, if it be a sin to divorce her when she ought to be kept, it is indeed a necessary torture. For either we commit adultery by divorcing her, or we must endure her daily strife." And so, even though in the early church history witches and magic users could be both men and women, starting with the publication of this book, people accused of witchcraft were almost exclusively women from here on. The main message of the text is clearly advocating for the complete and utter extermination of witches, and by that, Kramer meant women. There is no argument against that. He does not try to hide this in the text. It is very clear what he means when reading it. English clergymen for hundreds of years past his own death. This book alone is a symbol that words based around fear and the unknown truly do have power. But what does it really say about witchcraft? The words that Kramer used are chilling in the ways that he describes the different courts that he led against women. And the way that he lays out his arguments is methodical, but at the same time based in false logic. There are such beings as witches is so essential a part of the Catholic faith that obstinately to maintain the opposite opinion manifestly savors of heresy. This was intended as a direct threat to the reader, as he is implying that to get in the way of his campaign as George Gulser had done the previous year is on the same level as being a witch, and could be punished as heresy. He is maintaining with this first line that his opinions on theology is the new law, and that he had the backing of the current pope to make that so. And the connotations of the sentence would have been terrifying to a well-educated person of the time who did not agree with him. The language that he uses is also purposefully confusing throughout most of the text. He had a masterful use of communication, and would frequently have grammatically correct sentences that went on for 60 or 70 words at a time, that were full of complicated legal ideas that would call back to different theological concepts that were centuries old even at the time. By seeming more intelligent through this and invoking famous dead scholars in his work, and by having the Pope in his pocket, it gave him the appearance of being correct in everything that he said, and that ended up being extremely dangerous. In the text, Kramer goes on first to describe how a person goes about becoming a witch. He describes a detailed process of the affair, in which he says that 3 commencements were necessary: the temptation of the devil, the willingness of the tempted, and the permission of God. The third part being there because of free will, because to them, if God did not want there to be witches, then there would be no witches. But from their point of view, God favored the right to choose one's actions and choices on earth, and in doing that gave permission for witches to swear allegiance to the devil if they so choose, with the knowledge that this action would result in damnation and hellfire. In the text, Kramer tries to stoke fear of the ever-growing spread of witches. Long past, the incubus devils used to infest women against their wills, but modern witches willingly embrace this most foul and miserable servitude. A woman would sign her name into the devil's book to complete their pact. The devil also in this is said at the beginning of each Black Mass to demand a kiss of shame, or osculum infame, where a witch would begin the Black Sabbath by kissing his second face that was located where his anus should be. It was seen as a profane act of homage, and became a frequent topic of discussion during most witch trials. A man named to gain confessions. The trials would begin if a woman accused of being a witch was held in prison for a year without confessing voluntarily. She would be taken to court in a witch cart, which was a form of both spectacle and humiliation. She would be naked, so that she could not hide any of the devil's tools on her person. She would often be shaven, as hair was believed to be tied to a witch's use of magic. She would have to walk into a room backwards, as a form of safeguard against evil for the members of the court, and would be whipped or beaten if she made eye contact with anyone during the trial. Judges would be surrounded by salt and sacraments, which stood as another form of protection from the devil clouding his judgment. Trials consisted of 3 rounds of torture, per the suggestion of the Malleus Maleficarum, and it was uncommon for anyone to go past the 2nd round without confessing to have relations with the devil. It was common for those who did to die before the 3rd round was over. Judges were permitted to lie to the accused, promising them mercy that would never actually be delivered if they confessed. The argument for this was that it was done for the best interest of society and the state. One of the accounts of a witch trial reads as follows. The torturer made her sit on the rack, undressed her, and applied the thumbscrews. When the thumbscrews were applied to her toes, she cried out louder than before. The inquisitor inserted the mouth pair and demanded that she confess. When it was removed, she told her story. 10 years ago it happened that the devil came to her in the guise of a man. First they danced, and then they dined, and then she knelt before the goat and kissed him. Here she named 8 of her neighbors. The conditions of the time were so inhumane that death was a welcome embrace, as opposed to what awaited these women at their trials. One letter from a woman named Rebecca reads, O husband, they take me from thee by force. How can God suffer it? My heart is nearly broken. Alas, alas, my poor dear children, orphaned. Husband, send me something that I might die, or I might expire under torture. If thou canst not today, do it tomorrow. Write to me directly. Signed, R.M. 2 entire villages on the outskirts of Trier were exterminated. In another nearby, all but 2 were burned alive. The rampage spread across all of mainland Europe, and the fires raged wherever the Inquisition could be found. And the most frustrating...
Now I really have to warn you. Warning, some images could disturb the sensitivity of the viewers, because now we are in modern times. And if what you watched until now, it seems incredible, it's more incredible what these ritualistic satanic murders in modern times. And now I start to make you watch this horrifying case. I'm talking about the Satanic, the Chicago Ripper crew, and then I will even show you the victims. These are 3 videos, so really they are really strong and disturbing. I immediately start.
1980s, the satanic panic was in full swing and was the #1 fear for a lot of people out there. After all, particularly in a large Christian country like the United States, the last thing most folks wanted was for their families to be taken over by the influence of the devil. But while a lot of what actually happened back then may have been overblown, amounting to little more than some kids playing Dungeons and Dragons in their parents' basements, there were examples of real killing being associated with occult-like groups at the time. And one of the most notorious of those groups was based in Chicago. A collection of murderers, mutilators, sexual predators, and cannibals later dubbed by
the leader of the Chicago Ripper crew with the face of an angel.
The leader of the Chicago Ripper crew was born on November 30th, 1953 in Maynard, Illinois. While growing up, he appeared to be a fairly normal young man on the surface. Sure, there were some who found him to be a little too intense, especially when it came to the glare of his eyes. And there would later be accusations that he'd molested his sister and had been sent to live with his grandparents as a result. But he has continually denied that ever happened, and no concrete evidence has ever been able to prove such an incident occurred. Whatever the truth, it certainly wasn't enough to stop him from meeting and charming the woman who would later become his wife. The very same wife who would go on to give him 3 children come the late 1970s. And so at that point, now with several more mouths to feed, Robin was able to make more money working as a construction subcontractor where he was employed by, of all people, John Wayne Gacy.
So, if you have watched my previous documentary, I've just made my previous documentary before this documentary. Real serial killer clown was John Wayne Gacy. Even if John Wayne Gacy has been and will always be one of the fiercest monsters of crime history, in this case, he wasn't involved in the Chicago Ripper crew. He wasn't a Satanist. Rob!
Three would first start taking an interest in the growing fad of satanic worship that was sweeping across the U.S. during the early 80s. Basically, it was something that started during a time when, with conservatism on the rise once more following the election of Ronald Reagan, and parental fears of new board games like Dungeons & Dragons running high on account of its perceived satanic content, there was an increased interest in the occult, both in terms of squashing it. Those people fell in love with the idea for all the wrong reasons, as they saw it as a way to channel their darker urges. That was certainly the case for Robin Gedd, as at that point he got heavily reinvested in the whole idea of Satanism, something that he had first become aware of during his childhood when he managed to procure a copy of the Satanic Bible. The way he saw it, that belief system aligned with his values, particularly when it came to his sexual fetishes. And it was through that investment that he soon came into contact with 3 men who would go on to become his partners in crime. Those men were Thomas and Andrew Kokoralis, 2 young men from Villa Park, Illinois, who worked for Robin at the construction business he was operating, and who, at the time they started taking things to the next level, were still only around 19 and 20 years old. And it
the 4th member,
the same level of intelligence as the Kokoralis brothers, though was slightly older than them, as he would have been around 21 back then. How did Ed?
They started to gather here to make the satanic cults and worship
home once his wife left for work, and from there set themselves up in the attic, the place Robin would come to call their satanic chapel. Once inside the satanic chapel, a room that was only lit by candlelight and had a makeshift altar draped in a red cloth with 6 red and black crosses at the back of it, they'd begin their daily rituals. But those rituals wouldn't be contained to this one attic space, though, as during their early meetings the leader made it clear they were going to have to find some sacrifices for them to place at the altar if they wanted to appease the devil. Edwin and the Kokoralis brothers went along with it because by then, the 3 young men had taken to believing that Robin actually did have some kind of supernatural powers and that he could use them to control. Of 1981, they did as told without question. That first victim would end up being Linda Sutton, a 28-year-old single mother from Chicago who was abducted by the 3 young men on May 21st behind the Brer Rabbit Hotel near Wrigley Field, a popular hangout location for local sex workers. That particular profession likely made the crew feel like she'd be a better target to begin with on account of police being less likely to investigate her disappearance. The Chicago Ripper crew took her off the streets and back to an undisclosed location where they eventually proceeded to sexually assault her, kill her, cut off one of her breasts, and then dump her body in a field in Villa Park, not too far from where the Kokoralis brothers lived. Afterward, they took the breast to the Satanic Chapel in Robin's attic and placed it on the ground in front of them while they knelt at the altar and prayed. As they were doing that, Robin proceeded to read passages from the Satanic Bible, all before then masturbating into the fleshy part of the dissected breast. That wasn't all, because once that was done, he instructed his 3 followers to do the same, something they did without question. Once that was over, Robin cut up the breast into 4 parts and had each of them eat the parts.
Horrific!
Thomas Kokoralis's statement to the police later on, when, after being asked why he engaged in cannibalism so readily, he replied that it was Robin's desire to make them stronger, and so because of that, quote, "you just have to do it." It was even explained to investigators that the ringleader had been able to justify the whole thing by pointing to a passage in the Satanic Bible, the 7th of 9 Satanic Sacraments, which stated that man is just another animal, and so consuming its flesh was no different than eating chicken or pork. But while they may have come to accept that was a normal part of what they were doing, the authorities certainly wouldn't think a mutilated corpse was anything ordinary. And that's why, once the body of Linda Sutton was discovered just over a week later on June 1st, they treated the situation very seriously. Her body was discovered when both a maid and a manager at the Brer Rabbit Hotel found the corpse that afternoon after noticing a foul odor which began in the morning and got worse and worse as the day went on. Immediately after falling upon that discovery, they called the authorities and explained the situation.
On May 15th, 1982.
1982, almost a full year later. That was when, after presumably choosing to lay low for a while in order to let the heat die down, Robin and his followers abducted 21-year-old Lorraine Borowski from the parking lot of the realtor's office where she worked. After they held her captive, they carried on with the same modus operandi as they had before by taking their prisoner to a secure location and sexually assaulting her, all before then using steel wire to sever her breast from her body. Once that was over, one of the attackers killed Lorraine with a hatchet, and the body was driven over to a cemetery in nearby Clarendon Hills and dumped. While it would take some time, that body was eventually discovered there a full 5 months later, though during that intervening time, the killers remained hard at work. At that point, they'd chosen to go full speed ahead with what they were doing, and that was why, soon after on May 29th, they kidnapped a 30-year-old woman named Shui Mak as she was walking home from her family's restaurant at Hanover Park, a village just northwest of Villa Park. Initially, she'd been given a ride home by her brother that evening, but after having an argument with him, she decided to get out and go by foot instead. It was that decision that ended up sealing her fate, because before she could make it home, she was picked up and, like the prior 2 victims, taken back to an undisclosed location where she was sexually assaulted, mutilated, and murdered. When it came to getting rid of her body, though, the Chicago Ripper crew would be a lot more careful than to just dump her in a field. That time, they went to the effort of actually burying her at a construction site. And once that was done and they felt safe in the knowledge she wasn't going to be found, they set their sights on their next target, with that being 19-year-old Angel York, someone who was taken just 2 weeks after the abduction of Shui Mak. Unlike the other victims, however, after handcuffing Angel and forcing her to slash her own breast with a large knife, the killers decided to duct tape her wound shut and let her go by throwing her out of the van.
Angel went straight to the police
station and reported what had happened to her. Unfortunately, though, that wouldn't lead to her kidnappers being caught quite yet, as the description she gave authorities of the men involved ultimately produced no leads. After laying low again for a couple of months,
but when the police discovers
Lorraine Borowski and Shui Mak, and once they did, it quickly became apparent that they were dealing with the same person or persons responsible for the slaying of Linda Sutton a year prior. It was apparent that this was the work of the same killer, since, like with Linda, each of these women had a breast removed. Interesting.
But the police, at that time, they think to have to do with an only serial killer, an only man. They thought they were to investigate about a kind of Jack the Ripper. They didn't understand that there was a crew instead.
1982, they kidnapped 18-year-old Sandra Delaware and, after carrying out the same sordid actions on her as they did their prior victims, they killed her and dumped her body along the banks of the Chicago River. Obviously then, when she was found by police mere hours later, she was immediately identified as the latest victim of the mystery killer, with that identification coming on account of her also having been sexually assaulted, bound, and being minus a breast. And like with Linda, Sandra was also a sex worker, something that probably made it easier for the killers to feel like they could get away with the crime, especially as the heat was already on them. Such concerns over who they killed didn't appear to extend to their next victim as, now apparently emboldened again, less than 2 weeks later they grabbed 30-year-old Rose Davis, a marketing executive who was most certainly on a higher level of the social stratosphere than their prior victims. And again, before they murdered her, they cut off her breast and took it back to their Satanic chapel where they could masturbate over it and eat it. As to her body, well, that would be discovered about a week and a half later on September 8th behind a stairwell of a North Lake Shore apartment building. It was another sign that the crew were starting to get sloppy, or at the very least overconfident, as to dump a body 6th of that same year. Though that time it wouldn't be a woman they killed, rather it would be one of 2 men they fired at during a drive-by shooting, 28-year-old Rafael Tirado, a local drug dealer. It's unclear why he and his 18-year-old friend Alberto Rosario had been gunned down in cold blood by Robin and his crew. All that's known is, while driving through Chicago one day with Robin in the passenger seat, Edwin was told to slow down as his mentor had seen something he didn't like. And what he didn't like was what appeared to be a drug deal going down next to a phone booth on the sidewalk. So Robin took 2 guns from the back of the car, leaned out the window and opened fire, killing Rafael and leaving Alberto with serious injuries that he would later have to be hospitalized. Else they could abduct. The Chicago Ripper crew eventually settled on 20-year-old Beverly Washington. Her ordeal would be much the same as the women who had come before her, with her being taken off the street, then ferried over to an undisclosed location where she was tortured, sexually assaulted, and then, after her breast was cut off, left for dead near a train track. Crucially, though, she was not dead. No, perhaps in their haste to get away, or perhaps as a result of their increased overconfidence, the Chicago Ripper crew had neglected to do the job properly, and so as a result, Beverly had survived, albeit barely. That meant, when she was found by police a couple days later on December 6th, she was able to give them a detailed description of the men responsible for what had happened. It was That said, the van was a perfect match, even down to the feathers hanging from the rearview mirror. So the officer on the scene asked the driver, who had by then identified himself as Edwin Spreitzer, who the van belonged to. That was when he informed them it belonged to his boss, Robin Gett. Now feeling like they were getting closer to finally solving the crime, the cops on scene directed Edwin to his boss's house and had him call Robin outside. When he came out to see what was going on, it became clear he matched the description of the second man, before and this time formally arrested him. And he wasn't the only person they were arresting, because Edwin would also be brought in, with the belief that he was the lone accomplice of Robin, and that, between them, the two had been responsible for not only the attempted murder and dismemberment of Beverly, but also the murder and dismemberment of Linda Sutton, Shui Mock, and Sandra Delaware. Even with the walls now beginning to close in on him, Robin wouldn't budge an inch and would continue to deny everything. Unfortunately for him, though, the same could not be said of his accomplice, as pretty quickly Edwin began to break down under questioning and told police all about what had been happening. The way he described it, not only were he and his mentor in death responsible for killing 3 women and leaving another for dead, but they were also responsible for murdering a drug dealer on the side of the road and seriously injuring his teenage friend a few months prior. Clearly both were guilty, but if one thing was becoming more and more apparent as the question,
it was very difficult to make them confess, because Rob was completely silent and is stated to be innocent. Edwin broke up a few, but they couldn't find a way to make them confess until finally Thomas confesses everything, giving the police all the details about all the murders.
What corrected his belief? That was because, while the jury eventually determined there was enough evidence to find him guilty of attempted murder, sexual assault, deviant sexual assault, aggravated battery, and armed violence, there simply wasn't enough to convict him of outright murder. So, for that reason, Robin got off with the relatively lenient sentence of 120 years in prison, with that meaning that, while he would likely spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, he would escape death row, even if he was the ringleader of the whole thing. Of course, even if he was going to allow him to live, the judge would make his feelings on the convicted clear when after sentencing was handed down he told him, quote, "Only a devil would do these things. An animal would not do these things. Well, they'd receive the full punishments they deserved for their roles in the crimes, for the most part at least. As with there being no argument over whether or not they'd done the killing, there was simply no way out. Not that that stopped them from trying, though, particularly Thomas, who early on in the proceedings attempted to block his prior confession from being admitted into the trial. Unsurprisingly, however, he lost that attempt, and so, after a short deliberation from the jury, which lasted all of 3 hours, he was convicted of the sexual assault and murder of Rose Davis, and was sentenced to 70 years behind bars. And the reason his sentence was so low when compared to Robin's was because, as the man who had given the police much of the information which helped them to secure their convictions, a deal was made to treat him with some degree of leniency. That same leniency would not be afforded to his brother Andrew, as he'd end up being convicted for his part in the murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping of both Rose Davis and Lorraine Borowski, with that leading to him getting a life sentence for the former and a death sentence for the latter.
First execution.
Of waiting on death row, Andrew Kokorales was finally executed by lethal injection. Andrew was flown to the Supermax prison in Tams, Illinois, and would there spend the day praying and saying his final goodbyes to his friends via telephone calls as he tried to set things right as best he could. Prior to his execution, he would even decline to have a last meal, with him perhaps feeling he didn't deserve it on account of what he had done. And that's an assumption that's further bolstered by his final words before he was killed. Quote, "To the Borowski family, I am truly sorry for your loss. I mean this sincerely. Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand."
The second execution had to be Edwin, but you must know that in 2011 there was a grace for some prisoners, so his death sentence was turned into life in prison.
Never be released, and Robin continues his stay at Danville Correctional Center, with his parole date not coming until October of 2042, at which time he'll be 88 years old. At least one member of the Chicago Ripper crew can now call themselves a free man again. That's right, in what was certainly deemed a controversial move by many, Thomas Kokorales was granted parole on March 29, 2019, on account of his good behavior while behind bars. That meant that as of June 30th of the same year, he began living at Wayside Cross Ministries in Aurora, Illinois, somewhere he remains to this day. But while you
surrounding suburbs, several other women are found dead in Chicago and the surrounding suburbs.
These are the
Their valuables
victims.
are left behind, but their bodies are violated in cruel and ritualistic ways.
These were horrendous. Every single one of them, their breasts had been slashed.
Horrifying photos. As you may see, there is also half breast cut. This is really horrifying. This is really horrific because you may see a piece of the breast cut off in this horrifying, satanic, ritualistic murders. It's really horrific. Other images.
Under bridges and in the forest preserves that dot the outskirts of the city. But with robbery clearly not the goal, the motive remains a mystery. Police finally have a suspect. Robert.
And now, the horror never ends. The real horror never ends. I'm talking about the Fall River's satanic murders. Watch.
Far darker was festering. Whispers circulated about rituals held in the underbelly of the city. A cult gathered within the Harbor Terrace housing projects, and others spoke of their gatherings deep in the Freetown State Forest. They were consumed by it. Some claimed that they made human sacrifices to the devil himself. It began with a discovery no one could explain. The body of a young woman was found beneath the bleachers of a local high school, her hands tied with fishing line. She bore signs of ritualistic sexual torture. Her face and head had been crushed by repeated blows from a blunt object. Police released a composite drawing to local newspapers, which eventually led to her identification as Doreen Levesque. Just a few months later, another victim was discovered by a man walking his dogs in the wooded outskirts of Fall River. The victim was identified as Barbara Raposa, who had vanished just weeks after Levesque was found, and her face had been crushed with chunks of concrete left at the crime scene. The murder of Barbara Raposa bore an unsettling resemblance to that of Doreen Levesque, brutal, calculated, and ritualistic. Whispers of a connection began to ripple through the streets, and the city spiraled into paranoia. These weren't random killings. Something darker was unfolding beneath the surface, something beyond comprehension. What truly happened in Fall River defies understanding, and the stories of sacrifice and satanic worship were only the beginning.
You can also see all these magazines of that period.
And despite the arrests that would follow, some believe the true horrors were never fully unearthed. There are those who say the cult's influence extended beyond Fall River, stretching into nearby towns like New Bedford.
It was the early morning
of October 13th, 1979. Two women were jogging at the outdoor track of DeMann Regional Vocational Technical High School when they discovered a lifeless body beneath the steel bleachers. They contacted the authorities, and the Fall River Police Department assigned Detective Paul Carey with two assisting detectives, Alan Sylvia and Tom Joaquin. The Massachusetts State Police Department assigned veteran detective Paul Fitzgerald to the case. The crime scene beneath the bleachers was particularly graphic. The body was petite, weighing less than 90 pounds and measuring barely 5 foot. She had been entirely undressed except for her blouse. Her wrists and ankles were bound by twine and fishing line, suggesting a possible sexual motive to the crime. Her skull had been crushed by multiple blows from a blunt object, likely just hours before she had been discovered. Police recovered rocks from the scene, covered with her blood. She had likely been stoned to death. The medical examiner determined that she had not been sexually assaulted. It was determined that she had suffered multiple skull fractures, and the examination also revealed stab wounds to the back of her head. The medical examiner suggested that this was a ritualistic murder with likely more than one person being involved. The victim to newspapers, hoping to establish a positive identification. However, the details of the crime were not included, likely hoping to obscure the ritualistic nature of the crime from the public. Tragically, the victim's father recognized her from a composite and description in the Sunday edition of the New Bedford Standard Times newspaper. The victim was Doreen Levesque, a 17-year-old from New Bedford, a troubled runaway who had been in the system since the age of 12. She had a history of substance abuse and shoplifting. She had dropped out of school twice, and she was living between friends to avoid the street. It was rumored that she was a sex worker. However, Levesque was a complicated teen. Although she was regularly on the street, she did occasionally return home to her family. She had an interest in the Christian faith, although she was troubled by how God allowed his son to suffer so greatly. She removed Jesus from her crucifix and placed the small figure inside a box next to her bed. The scene of the crime had been ritualistic, and it matched rumors heard by the local detectives. The local workers and pimps, especially those who worked Bedford Street, had an interest in the occult and devil worship. The connections to ritualism and work led them to Maureen Spard
and she confesses
Satan to appear. Throughout the investigation, police frequently heard ominous references to the Freetown State Forest, a sprawling 5,000-acre reservation at the outskirts of Fall River. Known for its dense woods and isolation, the forest already had a notorious reputation. It had long been associated with violent crimes, strange occurrences, and tragic events, leading some locals to believe the land was cursed. Others described
October 1979.
Just a few weeks after Levesque had been discovered, a man named Andy Maltese contacted Paul Fitzgerald, the veteran state detective leading the investigation. Maltese was a local offender with a fascination for the occult. Maltese told Fitzgerald that he had two friends who knew about the Levesque murder. He introduced Robin Murphy and Karen Marsden. The two were romantic partners. Murphy seemed reluctant to meet, but Marsden was anxious and desperate. Almost immediately, she named the killer, Carl Drew. Karen Marsden said she was living with her grandmother at the time, regularly visiting her son JJ, who lived with a local foster family. Marsden said a few months prior she had been living on the street, and Carl Drew was her pimp. Robin Murphy did little to corroborate Marsden's statement, even when pressed. She was reluctant to cooperate with police. Murphy said that she had formerly been on the street, but she was living in Harbor Terrace now. She had also formerly been a sex worker, but she had transitioned into pimping girls on Bedford Street, including Marsden. Fitzgerald told them he couldn't do much with what they were giving, but the two refused to give any additional information. As they parted ways, Marsden told him, "If you find me dead, Carl Drew did it." In the following weeks, Marsden left increasingly frantic messages for Fitzgerald. However, she didn't provide any additional information about the Levesque case. At the same time, Maltese continued to call him with concerns of his own, claiming his girlfriend, Barbara Raposa, had gone missing in early November. It wasn't until January that her body was found. In the late afternoon of January 26, 1980, a man training his hunting dogs in a field behind an abandoned printing factory stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. The dogs had led him to a woman's body hidden away in the cold brush near Route 24 and Jefferson Street in Fall River. Her face was unrecognizable, crushed from repeated blunt force trauma, and her body had begun to decay in the freezing winter air. The local detectives, Carrie, Sylvia, and Joaquin, identified the body by scouring through local missing persons reports. They matched the description of the clothing and determined their victim was Barbara Raposa. She had disappeared in early November, weeks after Levesque. Surprisingly, on February 5th, Maltese contacted Fitzgerald and told him that he had a prophetic dream and knew what had happened to Raposa. He told the investigators that he had been up in a tree looking down at the scene, watching a tall man with long hair beat a woman. He saw that man was wielding a heavy piece of concrete or rock in his hands. He described the man striking the woman as she laid on her back. With each blow, her legs jerked off the ground. He told the police that he wanted to help, but he was unable to. He said that Raposa called out to him, asking for his help, asking for his forgiveness. They took Maltese to the scene of the crime, and he correctly located where the body was and how it was positioned. He recited details that had not been made publicly available, all under the guise of a psychic revelation. On February 7th, 1980, Andy Maltese was arrested for the murder of Barbara Raposa. The next day, Detective Murphy's account, while vivid, raised as many questions as it answered. Her knowledge of the crime scene was almost too precise, and her apparent detachment from the violence she described left detectives uneasy. The following day, Karen Marsden's grandmother called the station to report her missing. She gave the police a name to follow up on: Carl Drew. Following 14th, 1980, that all changed. While clearing brush on his property, a local man stumbled upon a partial human skull, its jawbone missing. Nearby investigator.
This is the strong image of the skull of the victim you are going to discover. A man was doing a walk and he stumbles in a real skull that belongs to... These are really tough images.
Recovered jewelry, a high-heeled shoe, blue jeans, and tatters of a woman's sweater. They discovered clumps of human hair and scalp, as well as the
Other two images. The skull had no teeth anymore.
Skeletal fractures from blunt force trauma. Using x-rays of her skull taken 6 months earlier, they identified the remains as belonging to Marsden. Both exemplars showcased the same bone patterns, which are as unique as fingerprints. Shortly afterward, Maureen Sparta told police that Robin Murphy had confessed to killing Karen Marsden. According to Sparta, Murphy claimed she strangled Marsden with her bare hands and suggested it would take years for the police to uncover what really happened. Later, during a wiretapped phone call, Murphy confessed again, this time claiming she murdered Marsden out of love for Sparta. Carol Fletcher corroborated parts of this story. She told investigators that she had driven Carl Drew, Carl Davis, and Robin Murphy to Westport, where Murphy and Drew ultimately killed Marsden. An arrest warrant was issued for Robin Murphy, and when she was apprehended, she told police that Marsden had become a liability. Marsden had witnessed Levesque's murder, and her continuous contact with the police meant it was only a matter of time before they would all end up behind bars. The following testimony is graphic. According to Murphy, Carl Drew forced her to drag Marsden from the car by her hair. What followed was a brutal ritual. Drew, Murphy, Davis, and Fletcher stoned Marsden as an act of shame and punishment, just as they had with Doreen Levesque. Drew then stripped Marsden of her jewelry, and when her ring wouldn't come off, he severed her finger. Murphy claimed that Drew snapped Marsden's neck with his bare hands before ordering her to slit Marsden's throat. Afterward, Drew and Davis decapitated her and kicked her severed head around the woods. In their final acts of desecration, Drew carved an X on the body and began speaking in tongues. He claimed he was offering Marsden's soul to Satan. He marked Murphy with the blood from the body. Then Murphy claimed she was forced to perform indecent acts with the corpse before it was dumped in the woods, soaked with gasoline, and burned. Marsden's brutal murder was a dark chapter in an already haunting investigation. It began with the grisly murder of Doreen Levesque, whose body was discovered beneath the steel bleachers of a local high school. Then came Barbara Raposa, her remains found in a desolate field near an abandoned printing factory. And finally, Karen Marsden. She had come forward with information about Carl Drew, Robin Murphy, and
Andy Maltese died of cancer.
1998. The trial of Carl Drew shortly followed. Murphy's testimony was a centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She recited what she told detectives about the satanic ritual in Freetown State Forest, where Drew forced her to participate. The jury found Carl Drew guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sadly, the murder of Doreen Levesque was never prosecuted, as the district attorney believed that justice had been served. Drew was already serving a life sentence. Robin Murphy stood trial, charged with second-degree murder in connection with the death of Karen Marston. Murphy faced accusations that she had actively participated in the ritualistic killing. Though she claimed that Drew had forced her to take part, the prosecution argued that Murphy's involvement went beyond mere coercion, portraying her as a willing participant. The defense portrayed Murphy as a vulnerable young woman under the control of a manipulative and violent man. They highlighted that Murphy had suffered extreme sexual abuse since childhood, and she had been on the street since the age of 11. In the end, Murphy was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.